Alright, man, so peace. So now I was going through my DVR, saw the morning news, and they had a nice little segment on William Shakespeare. Alright, anybody who's in their right mind is a fan of William Shakespeare in regards to his great skill as a writer and dramatist. Alright, so we're going to go through this segment, and I'll chime in here and there with certain tidbits that they leave out. Alright.
Oh, for a muse of fire.
And now a page from our Sunday morning almanac.
A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene.
April 23rd, 1564. 453 years ago today. The day traditionally given for the birth date of the great English playwright William Shakespeare.
Now, Shakespeare was born, he actually was born and died on the same day. All right, April 23rd, which makes me think that there was some foul play in regards to his death. All right, Shakespeare was a very popular man near the end of his life. He's nowhere near as popular as he is. He was nowhere near as popular back then as he is today. But he was gaining popularity, and he was very rich at that time because of not only the plays that he wrote, but the fact that he made good business decisions. All right, he was able to own a theater, I believe it's called the Globe Theater, and he also had his own acting troupe. He was also an actor himself, as well as a playwright. All right, he was a man of many trades. Now, he did not come from noble birth, but because of his great confidence, he was able to gain a great deal of prominence. But you know, we'll touch on these things as we go on. This statue, it seems to be based on a something that probably was relatively accurate. You see the hair, it looked like they probably just changed it up a little bit. The statue was definitely remodeled, but at some point it probably looked more like a so-called black man. Shakespeare, by the way, was a so-called black man. All right, for those who don't know, Shakespeare was a so-called black man.
The humble home in which he was born is the pride of Stratford-upon-Avon, a town jam-packed with tourists when Sunday morning visited back in 1987.
Fake image. Every image that you see of Shakespeare is fake. All right, they have his real depiction, but they won't let you know that it's him, or they won't show it. All right, you know, I'll leave it alone for now. But for those of us who know anything about the artwork of the time, oftentimes you'll see a painting of a so-called black man from that period, and they'll tell you that it was a drawing of a slave, or a painting of a slave or of a servant. But he's dressed in noble clothes, or he's dressed in clothes that would denote that he was not a slave or a servant. But they'll just tell you that's what he was, or they'll tell you that he came from Africa. Right? Meanwhile, you could be looking at William Shakespeare or Amadeus Mozart or Ludwig van Beethoven and not even know it. All right? All those men were so-called black.
By his 30s, he was in London and a published playwright. In 1599, Shakespeare and his acting company opened the Globe Theater, the stage for many of his best-known works. He wrote 38 plays in all.
Almost all of his plays, or the vast majority of his plays, were based on the history of the so-called blacks in Europe. Right? Plays like Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, King John, you know, the monarchy of the so-called English throne, Macbeth, right? All of these were based on so-called black men who either ruled or were prominent during the medieval time period. All right, these are things that most people don't know. I won't say you don't know, because there are certain brothers and sisters out there who may know that already. All right, but most of his plays were based on the medieval time period in which the so-called blacks ruled Europe. All right, Hamlet was a play about a Scandinavian leader or prince. Macbeth was about a Scottish prince. Macbeth was directly related. Both Macbeth and Duncan, if you've ever read the play of Macbeth, both the characters of Macbeth and Duncan were real life characters, and they were both related to a man who ruled in Scotland named Kenneth Niger, who was a black man. All right. or we call him today Kenneth Nigger, because that's what the word meant, right? Kenneth the Black. All right. And King Lear, I believe, was a British, or what they call a Briton, right? So-called Welsh ruler. And Othello, of course, was a so-called black man, even though they tried to deny it. King John as well was a so-called black man in history. He was of the Plantagenet monarchy line. All right, he was the enemy of, in folklore, he was the enemy of Robin Hood. Robin Hood also was a real man who lived, and he also was a so-called black man, believe it or not. You know, when I get the chance, I'm going to do a video on that. Okay? But Shakespeare was a black man. Most of the lead characters in his plays were played by a friend of his, a man named Richard Burbage, who was like the Denzel Washington of his day. All right? Shakespeare was able to get great fame under King James. I mean, he started out under Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I was a black woman, so-called black woman. And, you know, she was the daughter of King Henry VIII and what's this chick's name? Anne Boleyn. All right. Both King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were so-called black people. And Queen Elizabeth I was a so-called black woman. She used to dye her skin, by the way. She used to try to what they call today bleach her skin. All right. To make herself look a little whiter. Because that was around the time period where the so-called Caucasians started to take more of a prominent role in society. All right, but yes, Shakespeare was a so-called black man. Most of his plays were about so-called black men. He was also an actor in his plays. I think I mentioned that already. He was he was known for his confidence. He was much like, to compare him to somebody today, he'd be like a combination of I say like maybe Will Smith and Nas. All right, he was a great writer, and he was also a very prominent actor. He normally didn't play the lead roles in his plays. He normally would have some of his friends play the lead roles, but he normally played a role in his plays. All right, but once again, yes, he was a so-called black man.
Including Hamlet, with its famous graveyard scene, performed by Laurence Olivier in the 1948 film adaptation.
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy.
William Shakespeare died on April 23rd.
Yeah, he died on that day, but to this day they claim to not know what he died from. Now, some people claim that he died from, I think one of his friends said that they went out that night. It was him and a couple of his other friends. One was Ben Johnson. You know, that was a black man named Ben Johnson. One was named Ben Johnson. Another one was named, I believe it was it Michael Drayton? Something Drayton. But he was out drinking with his two friends, and supposedly he fell ill after they were out drinking. Now, England during that time was also hit by the so-called bubonic plague, which, as I stated, even though they call it the bubonic plague, it was more of a plague that seemed to mostly afflict people of color. All right, it was more of a plague that attacked the respiratory system, and the antibodies were unable to fight against this disease, whatever it was, mostly in so-called people of color. And you know how you know that it was a disease, whatever it was, it affected so-called people of color mostly, is because, like I said, they call it the Black Plague. And when the Europeans came over here to the Americas, whatever diseases whatever disease that was that wiped out many of the so-called blacks in Europe, when they came over here to the Americas, it wiped out a lot of the so-called blacks that were here in the Americas as well. All right. And even these so-called Caucasians, man, history will tell you that. All right. It wasn't spread by no damn rats. That's nonsense. But no, I believe that there may have been some foul play in regards to Shakespeare. Many people were jealous of him, particularly near the end. All right.
1616, his 52nd birthday, no less, and is buried at Stratford's Holy Trinity Church.
Now, notice they showed the church at Stratford-upon-Avon, but they didn't show his the bust that's there at Stratford-upon-Avon, which shows him as a so-called man of color. Now, even that bust seems to have been retouched a little bit, but it shows him as a so-called man of color. I'll probably make it the avatar for this video.
His dramas and comedies continue to be performed on stages around the world, not least at this recreation of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, which opened in 1997. There, as Shakespeare himself would have it, the play's the thing.
The play is the thing in which will catch the conscience of the king. So peace. Alright, man, so peace. So now this is just a continuation of the Shakespeare video that I was doing. I stated that Shakespeare was a so-called black man. I stated that because it's the truth. Now I also stated you could look up every and any portrait of Shakespeare. You will never find one that's accurate, and they will even tell you themselves that there is no accurate depiction of Shakespeare. They'll claim that there was no painting made of him that is realistic. That's a lie. They know what Shakespeare looked like. They have it in their archives. Like I've said, most of the paintings that you see are fake. All right. They have the real paintings underneath museums and underneath certain archives, you know, places like the Vatican or the Louvre or you know, whatever the top museums are, particularly in Europe, especially in London. All right. So now anyway, we're going to go through a name, a slur that was used against Shakespeare when he was first starting his career. And it's going to help us understand what Shakespeare looked like. So now this is on Shakespeare's entry on Wikipedia. It's going to quote a review that was made about Shakespeare by a man, I believe his name was Robert Greene. And yeah, his name was Robert Greene. You guys can check it for yourself. It's going through Shakespeare's career. It's going to say London and theatrical career. It's going to say it is not known definitively when Shakespeare began writing, but contemporary allusions and records of performances show that several of his plays were on the London stage by 1592. By then, he was sufficiently known in London to be attacked in print by the playwright Robert Greene in his Groat's Worth of Wit. It's going to quote a statement by Robert Greene. Let's see what he calls Shakespeare. There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. Says scholars differ on the exact meaning of Greene's words. No, they don't differ. They know what his words meant. All right. They know exactly what he meant when he called Shakespeare a crow. That was a derogatory term at the time for a so-called black man. All right. That's a term that lasted well all the way into today. But that's the reason for the term Jim Crow laws. Right. That term Jim Crow was an allusion to the black man and the derogatory slur for him as a crow. All right. Or I should say more the derogatory term. It more became a slur more down the line. All right. But during that time period, a crow was something that you might call a so-called black person, particularly one that was very dark skinned. All right. It says scholars differ on the exact meaning of Greene's words, but most agree that Greene was accusing Shakespeare of reaching above his rank and trying to match such university-educated writers as Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, and Greene himself. See, I told you there were many men who were jealous of him because the things that he did came naturally. The italicized phrase parodying the line, "Oh, tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide" from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3, along with the pun shake scene, clearly identifies Shakespeare as Greene's target. As used here, Johannes factotum, jack of all trades, refers to a second-rate tinkerer with the work of others, rather than the more common universal genius. Why is that? Because, like I said, Shakespeare was inspired by a lot of historical manuals, particularly pertaining to the British Isles. He would read history on the British Isles or Scandinavia, and a lot of his plays were based on that history. So they accuse him of being a plagiarist. All right. But let's concentrate on that term crow that he was called. So now this is on the website etimoonline.com, and this is very important for you brothers who want to understand things that are going on around you. You have to know the meaning of words, their origin. Is what's known as etymology. All right. I told you that the term crow was a term that was used for so-called blacks from the medieval time period. All right. Now let's look at the term Jim Crow. Black man, 1838. American English. Originally the name of a black minstrel character in a popular song and dance act by T.D. Rice that debuted 1828 and attained national popularity by 1832. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. See, they were mocking the so-called black man's speech and his ability to dance from back then. Where and how Rice got it or wrote it is a mystery. No, they know where he got that term from. They know that that was a term from antiquity that was used in reference to so-called blacks. Like I said about the word nigger, there's no such thing as a terrible word. There's just words that are used terribly. All right. These were basic terms that were used to describe a so-called black person, like crow or nigger. But when the so-called Caucasian came into power in the late 1700s, early 1800s, he took these words and he started to use them in a slur form. But let's read on. Even before that, crow had been a derogatory term for a black man. As an adjective from 1833 in reference to the song, association with segregation dates from 1841 in reference to separate railroad cars for blacks in Massachusetts. Modern use as a type of racial discrimination is from 1943. Jim Crow also could be a reference to someone's change of political principles from the jump in the song or reversible machinery, wheel about. That's nonsense. That last sentence they just made up out of thin air. On his arrival in Boston, Mr. Charles Lennox went to the Eastern Railroad Depot in order to visit his parents in Salem. But instead of being allowed to ride with other passengers, he was compelled to take a seat in what is contemptuously called the Jim Crow car, as though he were a leper or a wild animal. Once again, the term crow was in reference to a so-called black man. That's how you know Shakespeare was a so-called black man. But let's get further proof. Now, this website is in relation to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, for those of you who don't know, was the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I was the queen who was the monarch before King James. All right, like I said, Queen Elizabeth was a so-called black woman, as was her mother, Anne Boleyn. All right, made famous on the, in many stories about the Tudors. All right, she was the queen that Henry VIII wanted to be with instead of Catherine of Aragon, who also was a so-called black woman. All of them were so-called black. All right. But it's going to show you here once again the use of that term crow in regards to Anne Boleyn. It's going to start. In fact, there are only two descriptions of Anne from roughly her own time, which associate Anne with the color black. One is from the Catholic propagandist Nicholas Sander, who was born after Anne died and was clearly out to make Anne sound as witch-like as possible, with an extra digit, a huge wart, and other deformities that would surely, if true, have eliminated Anne from Henry's list of marriageable ladies. The other is Cardinal Wolsey's private nickname, the Night Crow. Right? Now, he called her the Night Crow, Cardinal Wolsey, because she was a dark-skinned woman. A metaphor which cannot be taken as physically descriptive. See, now that's the Caucasian throwing in their own 2 cents because they don't want to acknowledge that these people were so-called people of color, so-called black. All right? All other sources describe her simply as dark or brunette. All right. Now, let me specify the term brunette, even though now is used to describe a person as being as their hair color. Right. Is normally used for a so-called white woman's hair color, normally dark brown hair color. During that time period, the term brunette was for your skin color. All right. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. Brunette translates to brown for us, but may have had a much broader reference then, covering many hues of darkish hair. See, once again, the Caucasians trying to make it a hair thing. It was talking about her complexion, her so-called skin color. It's not clear that the medievals even had a term for dark red hair. Auburn, for example, originally meant whitish, and black could refer to colors, but in their deepest, darkest hues. Even the author is admitting that the meaning of words from the medieval time period was different back then than the Caucasian has changed them to today, right? The meaning of words have been changed so that they can hide the fact that so-called blacks ruled during the medieval time period, all right? That's why even today they'll try to tell you that a Moor is talking about a North African Arab, all right? But just to get back to the point, given the suspicious origins of the satanic image of black-haired Anne, no, she wasn't just black hair, she was a so-called black woman. I was surprised when I suggested on my Facebook page that Anne's hair was probably dark auburn or chestnut. I got a ferocious response. No way was she a redhead. Anne had black hair, not red hair. Right? The reason why they're saying that is because of her description. But it's not talking about her hair. It was talking about her so-called skin color. But we're going to get that now. Remember the term brunette. Remember what I told you about the term brunette. All right, now we're back on the etymology website. Now we looked up the term brunette. From the French brunette, from Old French brunette, brownish, brown-haired, dark complexioned. Diminutive of brune or brown, of West Germanic origin. As a noun, woman of a dark complexion. From 1710. The metastasized form, Old French Burnett, is the source of the surname Burnett. Burnett also was used of a wool-dyed cloth of superior quality, originally dark brown. All right, when they called a woman a brunette during the Middle Ages, they were saying that she was dark brown. That's why Cardinal Wolsey called Anne Boleyn the Midnight Crow. She was a dark-skinned so-called black woman. All right, that's why Shakespeare was called a crow. He was a dark-skinned so-called black man. All right. So anyway, peace.